Something I like doing with games that are now regarded as all-time classics is to go back and look at how they were reviewed at the time. It might shock you to discover that iconic clicking on ducks game, RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, got scores as low as... Wait, no, it's not going to shock you in the slightest, because I gave it away in the thumbnail just trying to get you to click on this damn thing, since YouTube won't give me the option to have a thumbnail make amusing duck noises when you click it instead. That 6 out of 10 score came from Eurogamer, and in the spirit of clickbait, the one I chose happens to be on the low end of reviews from the period, with the average score somewhat more generous, offering around 74%, which is still only 2% higher than the most controversial review score it's possible to give. Now there's a reference which is going to leave a bunch of you mystified. Thing is, even as someone who loved RCT2 enough to make it one of the few big box, medium box games I kept intact through multiple house moves and the apologetic excuses for storage space to be found in most smaller UK properties, I kind of agree with their reasoning. Because if you look closer at those middling to average reviews, RollerCoaster Tycoon has one big problem. RollerCoaster Tycoon 1. Many explicitly mention in their conclusion that if you don't already own that first iteration, you should add another 20% to their score. See, our perception of these games today is influenced by both their age and how we play them. RollerCoaster Tycoon came along at the point pre-rendered 2D art and 3D accelerated polygons started displacing old-fashioned hand-drawn pixel art in management games. In fact, it's right on the cusp, with most of the rides, shops and scenery rendered from 3D objects, but dithered down to the game's 256 colour palette, and rendered using shading settings to make them look hand-drawn. Not that I would know anything about trying to render 3D objects in a way which looks hand-drawn for use in a Chris Sawyer game. Simon Foster being generally a lot better at that sort of thing than me means the game's art stands up far better today than the blurry textures, low number of on-screen polygons, and excessive use of coloured lighting and fog, which blighted many contemporary 3D games. But that would be nostalgia calling. We love those graphics today because they evoke the intricate pixel art of late 90s PC games. Unfortunately, at the time they also evoked the art of late 90s PC games. When RollerCoaster Tycoon released in early 1999, this was fine, because looking like a late 90s PC game was fine in what was still, as indicated by the last two numbers in the year, the late 90s. While this was the tail end of even 2D games being able to get away with using 256 colour palletized graphics, RollerCoaster Tycoon gets away with it by including a huge amount of detail and a massive number of distinct sprites, partly enabled by the lower memory requirements of those 8-bit graphics. Quite literally, half as much, given the emerging standard at the time was for 16-bit 65,000 colour graphics. By the time RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 came out, 3.5 years had passed. This may not seem like much time at all in an era where I'm only just starting to have to turn down the detail levels on a PC I last upgraded in 2016. But this was a time when your average PC was outdated, before you'd even finished assembling it, thanks to both Intel and AMD getting properly stuck into a CPU speed war, which would eventually give you a near 4 GHz processor you could stick a cast iron plate on top of and use as a griddle. It wasn't just the CPUs. Between the release of those two games, we went from doing fixed function transform and lighting in software to having graphics cards with pixel and vertex shaders. You'd be lucky getting a game to run at all on a 6-year-old computer. One consequence this had for the world of game reviews is that a game could often be rewarded as much for pushing technical boundaries as it would be for having great gameplay. Something which may have been painfully apparent to anybody who actually trusted all those awards the Seventh Guest got back in 1993, and ended up sitting through a series of increasingly tedious brain teasers in the hope of unlocking another few minutes of FMV to show off their new CD-ROM drive. It's telling that when Trilobyte released just the puzzles for a budget release called Uncle Henry's Mind Blower, PC Format gave it a thoroughly stinking 39%. What I am getting at, and what indeed many reviewers in 2002 were also getting at, is RollerCoaster Tycoon did not appear to move the game on significantly, or even much at all. If you give it a close inspection, you'll notice more frames of animation for rides, better pathfinding and new guest behaviours. You might realise you can do a lot more with the scenery editor, and the game's publicity itself claimed far larger maps. But you would still be forgiven for some cynicism about Chris Sawyer's claim the game engine had been almost completely rewritten. And this is absolutely not my problem with RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. Even at the time, I would readily defend the clean and detailed sprite-based graphics to friends who said that Theme Park World was better because it was 3D and you could ride the rides in first person. Okay, not having that last one was a little disappointing, but only because the coasters looked so real and inviting in their 2D world, which Theme Park World's cartoonish low-polygon caricatures certainly didn't. Closer to my problem is a sentiment which turns up across almost all contemporary reviews, that RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 comes across as little more than an expansion pack priced and marketed as a complete game. A fair point, given the previous game had seen 2 expansions, added attractions, or corkscrew follies in the US, and loopy landscapes, both of which added new rides, a healthy collection of new scenarios, and quality of life improvements to the game engine, particularly in the case of loopy landscapes, which is where I should talk about how we experience the game today. The chances are, if you're into the series enough to be watching videos about it, you're playing in one of 2 ways. Open source reverse engineered recreation OpenRCT2, with the scenarios from both games and their add-on packs imported into it, or RollerCoaster Tycoon Classic, which reorganises the scenario list and features a selection drawing from both games and the first game's expansion packs, with minor tweaks in some cases. No, I don't know exactly what these are, but RCT Classic scenario changes is one of those rare cases where I would genuinely like the comments to gradually accumulate an exhaustive list of things everyone thought I missed out, because that sort of needless detail about minor changes between original versions and re-releases genuinely excites me. But all of which means, unless you're one of the few people running the original executables at 800 by 600 on a 14-inch CRT for maximum authenticity, and refusing to apply any of the extras subsequently distributed via the game's own website, what you're playing is the best scenarios from both games, with all the quality of life and engine improvements from RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. Which, much as I love the game, brings us to my gripe with RCT2 and also my slight disagreement with the reviews that claim it should get just as good a score as the original if you haven't played either before. RollerCoaster Tycoon's gameplay progression is horrible. I know I usually pick something technical as my excuse to get the virtual blackboard chalk out, but I like to take apart how the softer side of games works too. And comparing 2 games which are near identical in core gameplay terms is a great way to show how the sense of progression can make or break a game, even though in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2's case it doesn't so much break it as make it slightly less good than it could have been. A fundamental principle of game design is that games should reward the player for overcoming challenges. This means getting to see new places in a platform or adventure game, getting high-level equipment in an RPG, driving more powerful cars in a racing game, or seeing your empire spread in a game like Civilization. Designers will often separate this into short-term and long-term reward loops. If you've ever wondered why so many people find Minecraft hopelessly addictive, it's because of the interplay between the short and long-term loop. The long-term loop is when you see a cliff and think, that would look absolutely Boston with a castle on top of it. But to build a castle, you need stone for the walls and wood for the floor, and to get stone, you need to mine, which means you need torches to keep your mine safe from hostile mobs. But first you need to set up a farm so you can eat, which means you need water. Prerequisites spawn further prerequisites and opportunities for distraction, until you realise you've spent a whole evening working on short-term goals, without having built a single block of your intended castle. But that's okay, because you'll return to the game the following evening and, oh wait, this time there's a cave full of skeletons which needs to be sorted out, and you get the picture. Both RollerCoaster Tycoon games have a great short-term reward loop. Build rides and stalls, earn money from them, use it to build fancier rides and stalls, and then build even fancier rides which interact with the rides you built earlier. One nice piece of game design, which I don't think gets enough credit, is how cheap scenery is compared to everything else, meaning that while you save up for the next big coaster, you can spend the time decorating your existing rides, with the additional benefit that judicious theming will also increase the stats of nearby rides, allowing you to charge more for them. I'll admit it's not quite perfect. Like Transport Tycoon before it, if you don't have the basic mechanics of making money in the game well practiced, it's easy to fall into the trap where each subsequent ride you place earns less money than it cost, until it feels like you're waiting hours to save up enough to build a single merry-go-round or spiral slide. By the way, if that sounds all too familiar, build smaller roller coasters. No, even smaller than that. And you can charge way more for them than you realise in the first couple of years. Of course, if you have those game mechanics too well practiced, you fall into the classic Sawyer game issue of your income increasing exponentially. Although of course if you're that good, you should realise the real end boss of a Chris Sawyer game is running out of tiles to build on. It's when we get to the long-term reward loop that the two games differ. RollerCoaster Tycoon has the classic progression of a scenario-based game. At the start, 5 scenarios are unlocked. Completing one unlocks yet another. It's a classic system because it's a great one. You'll never get roadblocked by one single level you can't figure out. But there's still something to strive for. You're going through the low-level reward loop of building your park attraction by attraction to get the high-level reward of seeing new scenarios and rides, especially ones with pre-built parks to poke at and steal ideas from. In RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, everything's unlocked. You can see all the scenarios the game has to offer in the space of a couple of minutes, if your computer is fast enough. This may seem like a tiny thing, but in terms of your motivation to push through a frustrating scenario, it's huge. There's no reason to complete any scenario in RCT2 beyond getting a tick next to it on the menu. So where I slowly worked my way through all the scenarios of RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 until I got to see Mega Park, the same again for added attractions, in 2, I found myself playing 3 or 4 scenarios which felt like they offered instant reward and going, "This sucks, can't be bothered," to all the others. I didn't even complete the core set of scenarios in the base game until 2021, 19 years after I originally bought it. And that's for a game I actually love the core mechanics of. That's how important the sense of reward is. Imagine how short-lived this game would be if it was rubbish. But reward isn't the only problem with how RCT2 presents its scenarios. The other problem is one fans of the series will know from just 2 words. Amity Airfield. Progression in games is one of those things where, when it's done well, we don't notice it at all. We like the sense of skill that comes from diving straight into a new game without even bothering to read the manual, and feeling like we're doing well from the start, even though this is not so much our own supernatural abilities as it is good game design. And for me at least, a game which forces you to participate in unskippable tutorials, which lock off progress until you've moved the camera in all the directions and pressed the correct action button 3 times, is more frustrating than one which just dumps you straight into the middle of things with no explanation or apology. Learning things is best when you don't realise you're learning them. RollerCoaster Tycoon does this incredibly well. Because it's a 90s game, there's a tutorial in the printed manual, and also because it's a late 90s game, There's an in-engine tutorial that you can watch play itself to see how the game works. But you could confidently load up Forest Frontiers, having done neither of these, and have a decent chance of winning it even first time around. Forest Frontiers is an excellent beginner scenario. It contains only a single path leading into empty space, inviting you to expand it and build things around it. Even with such simple beginnings, that path is covered in benches and lampposts, making it obvious you can decorate paths with scenery items. The rides you have available at the start are simple to build, without any complex stat requirements to consider. The only one which might trip up new players is the length requirement for the wooden roller coaster and car ride. The default research settings introduce a looping roller coaster late in the year, letting you explore custom track elements once you already understand the basics of building a park. The relatively small starting area gives you a clue that roller coasters should be compact, so you can build several within your available space and budget. It even lets you build a boat hire, so you can learn how much that ride sucks and vow never to build one again. Just as important is that Forest Frontiers does not feel like a constrained tutorial level. You can build a satisfying park with a decent number of rides, or alternatively a cursed and horrible park which we shall never speak of again, but other than the low guess goal, and time period of just 1 year to ensure new players get quick feedback on whether this succeeded or failed, it doesn't feel like a level which is only there to teach you the basics. And this isn't just me talking about some notional new player experience I've long forgotten. I can open my original Forest Frontiers save game from 1999 and show you that I was able to explore all of the game mechanics, mess around with the terrain, and build some utterly cringeworthy new player roller coasters. Also, that if my stats are to be believed, I have just shown some of you a save game that is older than you are. At least it's not one of the ones with references to what were at the time oh so current internet memes. RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 opens with Crazy Castle, a park with a 4-year, 1,500 guest goal, and something that RCT1 doesn't introduce until its 5th scenario, a path network which will cause guests to get lost and spam red notification messages until you figure out what's wrong. The only reason it's the first scenario is because scenarios within each group in RCT2 are sorted alphabetically, hence the whole Amity Airfield problem. In fact, if you played RollerCoaster Tycoon in a language other than English, you possibly got a different order due to the localized scenario names. Electric Fields is the real beginner scenario here, but you'd need to be playing the game in Dutch to have it be first in the list. Notwithstanding that scenario groupings in RCT2 seem completely arbitrary, with Dusty Greens and Bumbly Bazaar both easier scenarios and better introductions to game mechanics than Factory Capers or Crazy Castle. Which is a good point to break and talk about introducing game mechanics. Even the simplest games introduce their mechanics progressively. Think about the first level of Super Mario Bros. Within a first few screens, you're introduced to movement, then question blocks containing coins, then Goombas, and then the idea that question blocks can contain different things and that mushrooms are good things to pick up. The game then gives you some time to bed in this knowledge and get used to navigating the level, before it adds in fire flowers, invincibility, and all of the mechanics around Koopas and their shells. Complex games have to manage this progression even more carefully, because there's so much for a new player to learn. Factorio is a good example. The endgame goal is to launch a rocket, which requires a sprawling factory consisting of dozens of production chains. But it doesn't start you with a rocket silo and have you make everything to feed it from scratch. You start with burner miners and furnaces. The simple idea that burners need to be fueled, and furnaces will cook ore into plates. The game then introduces belt and inserters, and making electricity for things which can't run on coal directly. The idea of research, and science juice, then automating things. Even in the mid-game, you're still being introduced to new gameplay mechanics like fluid processing, which the game breaks you into gently by starting with simple oil processing, and then giving you a more complex version, which involves piping in water and handling the various different fractions. Each type of science juice forces you to automate something your factory will need at the next tier, from belts and inserters early in the game to electric furnaces later on. Although, no matter how hard you try, you'll still never make quite enough blue biscuits. Is now a good time to mention that this is another example of nesting short-term reward loops, because making a reasonable quantity of blue biscuits inevitably involves setting up a facility to smelt huge quantities of copper and produce enormous quantities of green biscuits. Assuming I've not stalled everybody by the use of the term biscuits, it's worse than you think. There's a whole group of us that do it. RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 scenarios do exactly this kind of progressive reveal, subtly enough that you might not even notice them doing so. Forest Frontiers leave you to their own devices. Unlike me, you probably built a roller coaster that was a bit of a mess, but kind of worked anyway, because the guest goal's low and you can get away with a lot. So the second scenario, Dynamite Dunes, comes in and shows you how it's done, with a big centerpiece roller coaster that demonstrates cutting right into the terrain and going underground. It also adds the new challenge of building around hills, but still with enough flat land for this to be a gentle introduction, before later scenarios force you into working with the terrain rather than against it. Leafy Lake adds building over and around water, just in case you hadn't yet figured out that boat hires suck. But again, it does this with a low guest goal and a useful plot of land beyond the lake, which means while you can explore the technique of building over and around water, you're not forced to in order to complete the scenario. At this point, the game introduces Diamond Heights, with rides named after characters and themes in a children's play Chris Sawyer wrote in 1997, a park which gives you both a new type of scenario goal and also an established, fairly well designed park, which is a great time to do it. If you're playing the scenarios in order, you've already built 3 parks, mostly from scratch, and got some idea of which bits work and don't. So when the game gives you a well-developed one, you can understand why it works and figure out what you missed in your own parks. Poke closer, and you can see it introduces yet more ideas you might not have tried yet. Dueling coasters in the shape of agoraphobia and claustrophobia. And over in the corner, Doppelganger shows you how to build a Mobius coaster. If I had a quibble, it's that maybe they should have included some stalls and enough staff to actually keep up with the park. But I guess the game can't hand you everything on a plate, and there has to be something to actually do in the scenario. Rounding out the first 5 is Evergreen Gardens, which introduces the first really large guest goal, and 2 important concepts that will repeatedly turn up through the rest of the game. Guests getting lost on large path networks, and, by extension, the idea that the park you inherit at the start of the scenario might have something wrong with it, which needs fixing. Compare this all to the second game, which dumps a scenario full of different concepts on you as your very first introduction, with no clear indication where you should start building, and yet doesn't show you a well-constructed pre-built ride until Gravity Gardens, the 9th scenario and more than halfway through the game. The first time you see a pre-constructed ride of any type is in Dusty Greens, and this is a bad example for a new player, because both mini-golfs in this scenario are too long and full of guests complaining that they want to get off Mr. Bones' wild golf course. The game doesn't show you a fully functioning park until you get to Lucky Lake, one scenario of completing it, unless you count the separate Six Flags scenarios, which are both too large and too complex to really give new players a good idea of how to play the game, especially because the parks are too spread out, and the roller coaster's far larger than you'd want for regular scenario play. Which gets me back to that point reviewers in 2002 picked up on. With those huge guest goals, inconsistent difficulty, and lack of explanation of game mechanics, RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 is balanced more like an expansion pack. With an expansion, it's safe to assume knowledge of the game. Added Attractions starts off with the challenging Whispering Cliffs and only gets tougher from there. Loopy Landscapes offers a similar high level of difficulty throughout. If you were taking this as the third expansion pack for the original game, it would be totally fine for Amity Airfield to be the fourth scenario you encounter, because it's a reasonable assumption the player has already completed 81 other scenarios before they even installed this disc, and the first three have acted merely as a gentle refresher. For anyone new to the series though, that scenario was a complete roadblock, and without the mechanic of 5 unlocked scenarios making it obvious you're supposed to skip some and come back later, some players never realised that 2 parks on from Amity, they'd be playing Bumbly Bazaar, a scenario so easy, I typically play it without paying any attention to the goal, knowing I'll inevitably complete it by accident, often before the first year is out. Even considered as an expansion pack, I think RCT2 is lacking. To illustrate why, take a look at added attractions. This gives you 30 new scenarios and a pile of new rides, split between historic ones like the Side Friction Coaster and Virginia Reel, and ones which are brand new at the time of release, such as B&M Twister Coasters and Splash Boats, the latter being of particular interest to me, as Fort Park, my local theme park at the time, would open Tidal Wave the very next season, as part of the Amity Cove makeover of the Central Park area. And if you're not trying to recreate the rides in your nearest theme park, what are you even buying RollerCoaster Tycoon for? Don't answer that. There's a lot of good reasons. It's a pretty decent game after all. What made added attractions a great expansion pack in my view is that it added unique challenges which weren't in the first game. Guests who only like gentle rides in Gentle Glen, then guests who only like intense rides in Adrenaline Heights, preserved rides that you're not allowed to delete in Haunted Harbour, hitting the very painful limits of RCT1's underground building pools in Thunderstorm Park, Fiasco Forest, where every ride has a problem which needs fixing, some of them immediately, and perhaps my favourite scenario across all of these games, Rotting Heights, where you have to rebuild an abandoned park full of broken and incomplete rides. Please tell me you restored the Phantom when you played this. You've got to restore the Phantom. Oh, and this is the pack which Harmonic Hills comes from. Yes, the one where you can't alter the land, can't demolish the trees, and can't build above them either. Admission time. I quite liked this one. It turns RollerCoaster Tycoon into a sort of puzzle game. At least the guests in this level have a low preferred intensity, so you never need to build a big roller coaster, because you can't. In terms of reward, the pack also had some great set pieces for making it through the game. You keep going because you know you're going to uncover things like Giggle Downs, with its enormous 4-lane steeplechase ride. All of them give the impression that people put time and effort into making these scenarios. RollerCoaster Tycoon 2's base game scenarios are not as a collection bad, but they are inconsistent. And because you can click on any scenario at any time without restriction, it does encourage playing only a few favourites and ignoring the rest. I was surprised when I did my Let's Play of every single RCT2 base game scenario that I enjoyed every one I played, because that was not my recollection of time the first time round. Although that may be me discovering I can tolerate almost any game if I absent-mindedly witter away about the records of the flaming Groovies while playing it. Also, that the short-term reward loop is still very much present, and good scenario or not, it's still fundamentally an enjoyable game. What I do miss though, is that sense of love and care which went into scenarios like let's recreate Lightwater Valley in the game, which in case you're wondering is Katie's Dreamland, and explains why you have that mad enormous double lift hill coaster, which in real life is called the Ultimate, and had such a troubled gestation. It ended up being overseen by engineers from British Rail Engineering Limited because, hey, a roller coaster is just a particular sort of railway, right? The keep your arms and legs inside the car at all times signs on the real-life Ultimate even have the same size and use the same typeface as the signs you find at BR stations warning you not to get too close to the edge of the platform. Of course, the team might have had a bit of a soft spot for Lightwater Valley, as it is where some of the sounds for the game were recorded. Considering that the Ultimate was originally designed to show off Lightwater Valley's landscape, and Storm does the same in miniature, too many of RCT2's scenarios are either flat or have terrain which looks like it was made in 30 seconds with the slope tool. Compared to the varied and flowing landscapes of RCT1, it's just not as much fun to thread roller coasters through, and often I find myself raising or lowering land to make it feel like I'm building something sympathetic to some notional pre-existing landscape, rather than merely erecting roller coasters on top of a car park. It's not just me. I found it noticeable that while researching this video, whenever I stumbled across a forum thread or poll for "What's your favourite RCT scenario?", the ones people mentioned were overwhelmingly from the first game and its expansion packs. But the core mechanics are there. The engine did have some nice new features, including the stackable scenery, and as I've already shown, RCT1 took a while to become a truly great game. Many of the classic levels and rides we remember now actually came along in its expansion packs. RCT2 itself also benefited early on from 16 of the scenarios from the first game being converted and offered for download on the game's website. If RCT2 was the first of the games you owned, this really did give you the best of both worlds. Those classic scenarios, with all the new features like stackable scenery items and easy underground building. So, if all RCT2 needed was some better scenario progression with a bit more love and care, maybe the initial frosty reception in magazine reviews was turned around by what came later? No. Something Chris Sawyer talks about in interviews is his view that there is a point where he is happy with a game and considers it done, where the engine contains all the features he wanted it to have, and there is little point in returning to the concept, as there's nothing left to add. I don't know if this reticence to return to what he considered a definitive statement factored into Infogram's decision to outsource creating expansion packs for RCT2. But outsource they did, with the task landing at Frontier Developments. I find it difficult to properly trash a piece of software, as from the outside you never know what constraints made it the way it is. It's obvious from RollerCoaster Tycoon 3 and the excellent Planet Coaster that Frontier really did know their stuff when it comes to making theme park games, both then and now. Even expansions for theme park games are soaked and wild are some of the best expansions in the series, with a ton of new gameplay mechanics and options in each. So if Frontier produced a really bad bit of software, it almost certainly wasn't because they didn't know what they were doing, and definitely wasn't that they collectively woke up one morning and went, "Today we're going to make terrible things." Instead, it's more likely that they weren't given the budget to put enough people on it, or that they had a deadline so short all they could do was throw together the first thing which compiled, ran and looked vaguely like a game. It certainly can't have helped that they were working with something programmed in a language almost nobody was using in the early 2000s. All of which is preamble for me absolutely trashing Wacky Worlds and Time Twister, the two expansions for RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, because they very much do not make the game better in any way other than the length of time you can spend playing it for a charity marathon. I always feel Simon Foster doesn't get nearly enough credit for his contribution to these games, because it's the interplay between Chris Sawyer's highly optimised game engines and Simon Foster's intricate graphics which really give them their charm. It's not just that Transport Tycoon and RollerCoaster Tycoon track thousands of pieces in the game world. It's that all of those pieces look great and have all kinds of detailed animations which make the game satisfying just to sit and watch, much like a well-designed model railway. If you could have thousands of things on screen, but they were all a bit ugly, you wouldn't have anywhere near the game. And I don't need to offer this as pure conjecture because, hey, here's Wacky Worlds. Now again, it may not be the case that Frontier set out with the intention of, let's make a load of scenery objects that are hopelessly out of scale with the rest of the game and look obviously out of place compared to the originals. It's more likely they set out to create some interesting and unique scenery with much more animation than what you could find in the base game, and then had neither the time nor the experience of Simon Foster to refine it into pixel art style graphics which fit in with the rest of the game. In case you couldn't tell, I would love to know what actually happened, because I bet there's a story there, even if it's only the classic IT story of short deadlines and limited money. Time constraints and a lack of budget would explain why they merely reskinned existing rides, often with ugly and out-of-place rendered models that aren't the correct size, rather than picking up some assembly language textbooks and altering the code to implement brand new rides or interesting mechanics. In some places, this gets very obvious, such as the Maharaja steam trains which ride around the map with creepy headless guests, because they're based on a covered train with a lower roof that uses a headless guest model to prevent clipping issues. And the scenarios? Well, I have mixed feelings here, because someone did spend time and effort creating them, and a few of the ones in expert parks are actually fun to play. Yes, often with disgustingly ugly scenery items, but I will give Wacky Worlds this. The national flags made out of flower beds in European cultural extravaganza are great. The recreation of Uluru is a wonderful terrain on which to build one of the most disrespectful ideas for a theme park ever. This plateau above a huge rainforest is some great terrain work, and even if they're built out of eyeball-searingly awful scenery objects, these conveyor belts and elevators on the diamond mine scenario must have taken a while to set up. Where they don't appear to have spent much time is testing them. Too many Wacky World scenarios have guests wandering around lost on road networks, which were a right pain to isolate and fix. When I played Rio Carnival, the easiest option was to demolish everything and start again, which also meant I had so much money I could complete the scenario without even having to consider my finances. The Inca scenario, which mentions a height restriction in its description, turns out to have nothing of the sort, and you can happily build rides as tall as you want once you're in-game. The European Cultural Festival can be completed simply by running advertising campaigns. They also fail at providing reward for progression until you're into the last few scenarios, a point by which most people will have given up. Well, except this is RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, and everything is unlocked from the start. So it's more like there being no reason at all to play those early boring scenarios when you can just skip straight to the interesting ones with the nice pre-built parks. One thing which made Added Attractions such a great expansion pack is that from the start, almost every level has you doing something new. You're rescuing an old park that's badly in debt in one scenario, then building a huge park from scratch across a ready-themed area the next. Now, Wacky World does have some interesting ideas in the expert parks. Half the challenge in the Oasis scenario is successfully getting guests out of that tiny starting area and into your park proper. Fun at the Beach has you trying to expand to the point where you could connect up a pre-existing park through some very expensive land to buy. But those are rare highlights. Outside of those, for a pack that self-describes as wacky, RCT2's first expansion is surprisingly monotonous and one note. It's a set of scenarios which largely play out the same way. Fix a badly designed path network that's causing all your guests to get lost, demolish the worst of the scenery, and then start building rides on an expanse of space so huge that not once do you need to do the slightest bit of planning. Even for the inevitable, build 10 enormously long roller coasters scenario, which just happens to be my least favourite goal in the entire game because of the inevitability with which it becomes tedious and annoying by around roller coaster 6 or 7. Well, I guess being one note, monotonous and ultimately tedious and annoying is the inevitable fate of anyone or anything which self-describes as wacky. Except wacky races. That's great. Damn you, obvious counterexamples. Speaking of things from the late 1960s, that lets me segue neatly onto Time Twister, in which the late 60s is one of the time periods you get to twist. Time Twister is kind of better, I guess. It at least has some scenery you would actually want to use, with these cars from the rock and roll theme being the mainstay of many a custom scenario car park, and unusually for a scenario item from the Frontier expansions, actually sort of the right size for the guests. It also has a couple of good rides, like the double-deck carousel, and this kooky giant spider variation on the twist. Although, as ever, most are just variations on existing rides with gimmicky vehicles that don't look right, or even, in the case of the 1920s cars, manage to break the ride every so often by being far too long for the game engine to handle. Plus it has one of my favourite shops in all the games, the dinosaur-themed soft toy stall. Look at this little guy. It's a shame that Frontier only got to the point of making playful and fun objects, in keeping with the rest of the game, for about 15% of Time Twister. Because if they had managed to do this consistently, across both expansion packs, I think they'd have gone down a lot better. The rest, it's much of the same old story. Occasionally interesting terrain, consistently ugly scenery, and yet more huge flat expanses where you just stamp out coasters without any imagination or planning needed. Unlike Wacky Worlds, the early scenarios are much stronger, and there's a case for Sherwood Forest being a legitimate beginner scenario with its easy goal and fairly decent pre-made park. Perhaps too decent, and too easy, given you can complete it without even building anything. It's at the Woodstock scenario, where the typical RCT2 problems start. Woodstock is essentially a faster paced amateur airfield, half the number of guests, but half the time to complete it. The problem here is that if you're a new player it's too difficult, but if you're an experienced player, the enormous amount of flat space and amount of paths to delete for money make it too easy. Once you hit the challenging parks, all the problems with the Frontier expansions come back. The giant Ray Harryhausen style set pieces on the animatronic film set scenario look great in isolation, but they don't fit with the rest of the game. And I find these big ready-made parks impressive as a sort of show-off, look what we can do statement, but with so much of the land already built on, you're reduced to filling in around the edges with no real ability to make your own statement rides, making these scenarios drawn out and dull to actually play. And what's with every pay-per-entry scenario having the amount of money guests carry start at just £40, Frontier? It means you have to be exceptionally cautious with money until you hit the point, around 1,200 guests, where enough leave the park to keep new guests flowing and the entrance fees coming in. Or just keep advertising, which is, after all, the RollerCoaster Tycoon free money button. RCT2's bizarre alphabet-induced difficulty curve and miscategorization of scenarios is also very much in effect during this expansion pack. Jurassic Safari, a challenging park, is a satisfyingly big scenario with a hefty guest goal, but after that you're in Schneider's Shores, which may as well be in the beginner group, given you can complete it in the first couple of months, even if you don't go out of your way to cheese it with excessively intense rides. And while it's still inconsistent, I find Time Twister has more good scenarios, better distributed through the pack than Wacky Worlds, making it far less of a monotonous slog. There are a few I genuinely enjoyed. This Stone Age scenario has some interesting terrain, bringing to mind Razor Rocks or Thunder Rock from the first game. Plenty of satisfying verticality to be explored. What can I say? I like getting ideas above my station. But still, what amounts to a couple of nicely made scenarios with interesting challenges, a couple of boring to play parks showing off what can be done, and a lot of filler, are the kind of thing you'd expect to be a downloadable bonus from the game's website, not a surprisingly expensive expansion pack. And reviewers at the time made this abundantly clear. The scenarios in Wacky Worlds were so disappointing, the RCT2 community decided to create its own expansion pack called UCES, or User Created Expansion Set, based around two stories called The Time Machine and Katie's Dream World, and featuring its own custom scenery, shops, and even a custom ride type using similar reskinning techniques to Frontier. I should totally do a video about this, when I'm not already 13 pages deep into a script about RCT2's difficulty curve and expansion packs. Even without covering the user-created expansion set in detail, its very existence highlights the problem with Wacky Worlds and Time Twister. Both are lost opportunities. When you look at what's happening around the Open RCT2 project with the addition of Alpine coasters, single rail coasters, and RMC hybrids, you wonder what could have been if Frontier had been able to dive into the code and start adding in new ride types. Which probably means having Chris Sawyer on hand due to the aforementioned written in x86 assembler problem, one which certainly came up when porting the game to mobile devices as RollerCoaster Tycoon Classic happened, and was resolved by, well, having Chris Sawyer on hand. I maintain that, with the relative paucity of flat rides in the game, the Great Lost expansion pack is a hypothetical carnival capers, a pack full of classic funfair rides like the Zipper, the Waltzer, the Chair Swing, the Crazy Cage, and what I'm still not entirely ready to believe is called a Miami. Small scenarios where you have guests with limited money, maybe a couple of new compact roller coaster types, and new stalls involving games of chance. But well, it was not to be. And yet, after all of that, RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 is still an absolute classic, and if you read a modern review, it will be full of superlatives. Because there's no expectation a 20-year-old game needs to push forward technical boundaries. There's no need to caution away people who paid full price for RCT1 and its expansions only a couple of years prior. In fact, they're probably including those scenarios in their assessment. If you're playing it again in the modern era, you don't need the game to progressively teach you a bunch of mechanics you still half remember from the first time around. I'd even grudgingly admit that in our modern times of buying retro games for a couple of quid and just dipping in and out of them when we feel like it, having everything unlocked from the start is probably fine. I mean, I still turn on the option in OpenRCT2 that locks away scenarios the way the first game did. Then I'm the kind of person to play through the entirety of Wacky Worlds and Time Twister out of sheer spite. Perhaps more importantly, RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 contained a little button that I've wasted this much of your time and not even mentioned yet. Something that was new over the first game. Yes, one of the big reasons I wanted RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 when it came out, even though it was so obviously similar to the game I already had that my relatives refused to buy it for me as a Christmas present, is that it came with a built-in scenario editor. I've talked before about how the availability of an editor can lift even a mediocre game, and RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 is absolutely not a mediocre game, no matter how much I complain about the progression of the scenarios, not reaching the heights of RCT1. Which is my memory of playing RCT2, making wild, expansive scenarios in the editor, and then filling them with roller coasters. Usually scenarios which were way too easy, because 2002 me was not quite as aware of what makes a satisfying game as 2022 me, possibly because in between that time, I played a lot of unsatisfying RollerCoaster Tycoon scenarios of my own creation. Sadly, much of this gameplay happened during a time where my approach to preserving files for the future consisted of unplugging whatever hard drive I was upgrading from and sticking it in a drawer. And anyone who's had to wrestle with mounting an esoteric file system that was supposed to be the next great thing in 2004, or indeed heard the distressingly terminal bearing noise that comes from a hard drive which hasn't been plugged in for the last decade, will know exactly how that went. Still, I'm pretty sure I downloaded a bunch of scenarios from the internet, tried to find recreations of Thorpe Park and Chessington World of Adventures, and there was definitely a point where I got annoyed with scenarios that required Wacky Worlds or Time Twister, until I downloaded one, and found that by some unexpected quirk the game could be made to package the expansion objects in the scenario as if they were custom objects. And you bet creators made full use of that. Since neither expansion had any significant code changes to prevent using its objects in the vanilla game, well, you can see how, even if they had been good, sales might not have met expectations. The internet being the hive of scum and villainy it was before the corporations took over. And still is. Except with more capitalism. Before I get too far diverted yet again, I think that's enough self-indulgent waffle for one video about RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. Because much as I may enjoy looking at something I love through a critical lens to see why other people didn't like it so much, I have basically ended up taking an awful lot of your time to say what is effectively one PowerPoint slide. I like this game. It didn't review well at the time. It wasn't considered a big advancement over RCT1. Game progression and scenario quality weren't as good. This didn't matter because you could create and download scenarios. Also, I didn't like Wacky Worlds. Well, anyway, it's time to hear from all those Wacky Worlds apologists for the word wacky in general, those who can't figure out the difference between not liking something and looking at something you do like through a critical lens, and, more importantly, those people who can exhaustively list every scenario difference between the original games and classic. Or tell me what was actually going on circa 2003 at Frontier Developments, even if it's no more dramatic or exciting than Infogrames basically gave us 50p and 2 weeks to develop something. Cheers for watching. If you'd like to watch more about Chris Sawyer games from a younger, more concise Timberwolf, who has yet to feel a pang of regret about cheap jokes they've written every time they see a photograph of John Romero doing something nice and or being an all-round lovely person, click here. Or alternatively, if you'd like to watch me spend way too long talking about other late 90s games from the Microprose stable, click there. You could also subscribe for more worryingly in-depth videos about games and their mechanics, but I ran out of hands, and who would want to do that anyway?